Hello.
Hello, we're nerds! Happy Sunday. It is January 19th, 2020, and we are here to talk about the fantasy genre. Wow. If you've never joined us for one of these before, welcome. We are going to be spending the next hour-ish talking all about fantasy as a genre, kind of digging into its past, also particularly in our own lives, since all of us write fantasy. Talking about the tropes of it. We'll probably talk about world building a good amount in this one. We've done genres in the past like horror, and we've done romance, right?
So.
Romance and paranormal. So if you type like digging deeper into genre in the YouTube search bar, those will probably come up if you're interested in any of those. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. So I wanted to just kick it off, since we do all write fantasy, with what was the first fantasy book that you remember like influencing you as child you? Erin.
It's hard to remember actually because I read a lot. Like that was mainly the only thing I was interested in as a kid. It got to a point where my parents tried to ban it from the house for a while. They said that I was like drifting untethered because I was in a fantasy world all the time. I don't know what that means. And I became a fantasy writer. So yay, that worked. So Redwall was the first thing that I remember just like vigorously consuming. Like I think I own probably, I don't know. Brian Jakes has written a ridiculous amount. I don't know how many are left over in the series, but I know I own like at least 20 of them. Because I collected all of them and read all of them back to back. And I remember that was the first thing I wrote fan fiction of, actually. Because like
precious.
The description of the feasts and stuff, I was like, I just want to live there and eat their food and hang out with squirrels. I don't know. It was good. So that's mainly what I remember.
That was the first fantasy book as a child that I hated.
There we go.
Fight.
Emma.
I definitely don't remember what was like the first I read, but definitely one of the earliest I read that I can still remember was the Chronicles of Narnia series. Partly because that was like one of the few like fantasy type things I was allowed to read because Jesus.
Oh,
yeah. And because it was like bad witchcraft. But yeah, and so I definitely remember reading those and being like, this is the best. Like I love these books set in a different world. But also one of the really early books that I think had a really big impact on me, like wanting to write fantasy, was Gail Carson Levine's The Two Princesses of Bamar. I was obsessed with that book. I've read it so many times. And I feel like it's one of the ones that's like really influenced like the types of books that I like wanted to write growing up. So
yes. Kelly.
This has been hard to think about because, like, I can't remember reading fantasy books when I was really young. I think I read a lot of, like, contemporary stuff, like Sweet Valley and Babysitter's Club and that kind of thing. But then when I was, like, a younger teenager, my older cousin started lending me her, like, urban fantasy books and, like, adult urban fantasy. And that is when it, like, fully hooked me. And that's when I, like, that's all I read for a while. So it was, like, some of my still favorite authors, like Patricia Briggs and Anne Bishop. I was way too young to be reading that kind of content, but I could not get enough of it.
Rachel.
So the first book that I thought of, I think I was about 6 years old, and I still have a copy. And it's Into the Land of Unicorns, and it's about this little girl who like lives with her like awful stepfather. And when she's out in the fields one day, she finds this white mare who has a little white foal, and the foal, it has a bulge on its head, and they just think, oh, it's, you know, it's hurt or it's like deformed or something weird. And she's like, can we keep it? And the dad's like, all right, sure, whatever, but you have to feed it. And then it turns out that the little foal's actually a unicorn, and it's like, that's a whole series. I think I tried to track down some of them, but like they're out of print now. They're so old. But I still have that one. That was like the first thing, and I remember being quite young when I read that and just being like, this is so wonderful and magical. And
hey, did you guys ever read this? It was like a sci-fi / fantasy series about a girl who actually had a unicorn horn Did anyone else do that? No.
Bless.
Did I dream that up in a fever dream? I swear I saw them at the library and was like, this is so cool when I was like 14 or something.
Oh my
And I
God.
got my hands on the whole series. It was literally about a girl and she was being pursued by people who wanted the horn because it was like valuable.
Interesting.
I don't remember this book series. Now I gotta look it up. See if I just
Yeah.
That is incredible. Please do. I really want to know what that is. It is ridiculous.
We also had a comment regarding your book, Erin. Caitlin said, have you gotten the Redwall cookbook?
No, I really wanted to. There was like the recipes for like all their ales and ciders and stuff that they were always drinking, the like all the berry ones and like all their delicious sounding bread. Seriously, I could probably go back and read it now and I would start drooling because the descriptions of the food. I was always hungry reading that book series.
Funny.
Hey, someone found it. A corn and Caffrey. Yes. I didn't make it up.
I have to check this out now.
I thought it was called something, a corn, and I was like, no, it can't be that. That's ridiculous. And it reminds me too. Have you guys seen the Office episode where Dwight is collecting all of the action figures that have horns?
Oh, yeah.
My horn can touch the sky. I was like, am I making this up because it's on The Office? I don't know. Thank you. A corna. Cool. I was a cool kid, obviously.
Definitely. Yeah. Redwall was one that I really, really, really wanted to get into as a kid, but they tried to make me read it in school. And I was like, these are animals. These are not humans.
This is not realistic enough. How dare you?
Boss of me, you're not my real mom teacher. For me, the first one that I super remember reading, I actually have a copy of the book here with all the yellow pages, but it's A Wrinkle in Time.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Many times as a child.
Yeah.
The
I
whole
remember my
series.
6th grade teacher reading that to us. Like,
Yes!
it was, we would do like 3 chapters every class or whatever, and like read A Wrinkle in Time.
We've got some people letting us know in the discussion section what their first fantasies that really influenced their lives were. We've got Alice in Wonderland, The Dragon Singer, also by Anne McCaffrey.
Everything by Anne McCaffrey.
She wrote a lot of fantasy.
Yeah. We got some Redwall fans,
Nice.
Harry Potter and Aragon, Mistborn, Enid Blyton, The Faraway Tree.
I loved Enid Blyton growing up. Another obsession for sure.
Got, where did it go? Paxinarion by Elizabeth Moon. Dragonlance series and the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. So much good fantasy. World.
Definitely one of the first like books I tried to write that wasn't like a Harry Potter ripoff, because first I wrote a few Harry Potter ripoffs. So one of the first non-Harry Potter ripoffs was an Aragon ripoff.
Which is a Lord of the Rings ripoff. So extended ripoff.
I definitely tried to write some kind of dragon thing when I was like 13. It was like, oh, dragons, yeah.
My mom read us The Hobbit when I was really little. And so all of the first fantasy stories I started doing were like these epic quests that went on and on and on.
Aw.
I'm just picturing like all of us as small readers now. Yeah, so obviously fantasy has an extremely long history, going back basically since people started telling stories. So basically since like human consciousness evolved. But some of the earliest people given credit for writing like explicitly fantastical works are like George MacDonald in the 1850s or whatever.
Wow.
And then high fantasy or like epic fantasy, obviously J.R.R. Tolkien is considered the big father of all of that. Have you guys all read Tolkien?
Yeah.
I never finished the trilogy. I made it like halfway through the last book.
I devoured the whole series when I was very young. and I just knew that there was a lot of big words and that there was a lot of really cool stuff happening, but I wasn't like at the age where I could really wrap my mind around it. And I just like plowed my way through because I was like, I like fantasy. This is fantasy. I am reading this. It was like 13 or something.
Yeah, I read them in like 6th or 7th grade because the movies were coming out, and I had seen the first 2. So like the first 2 were out, I saw them, and then I was like, I'm gonna read these books before the last movie comes out, so I like know what's gonna happen. And so
you have to read them so you can be properly outraged with everyone else that Tom Bombadil was not.
I am very thankful that Tom Bombadil is not included.
Yeah.
I was on Lord of the Rings forums, and like everyone was so angry that they had excluded him. It was
To be clearly, that's one of the only edits that I'm like happy with.
Yeah. You know, on Parks and Rec, the TV show, there's like a part where Ben, someone references Lord of the Rings to Ben, and he says, "To be honest, I wasn't a fan of Peter Jackson's interpretation." That was like the only line in the whole TV series that I was like, this is out of character. How could anyone not like this adaptation?
Oh man. Oh, a lot of really hardcore ringers.
Yes.
That one.
We had a question from Vanessa. Has anyone read The Silmarillion? It's been very
Nope.
I own it.
I did too. I bought it and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna read this. And I like, cracked open the first page and was like, nope. No, thank you.
Just it's making me think about how much less fantasy there was to choose from when I was a young reader and like falling in love with fantasy. Like I read The Lord of the Rings because there wasn't that much else to read versus now when there's just so much.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think of like my transition from like being a kid into reading like teen stuff and then into reading like adult fantasies. Like I kind of skipped Redwall. I kind of skipped reading middle grade, honestly. And because it was like coming to be a genre just as I was like 12, so like it wasn't really quite there yet. And so I started reading YA stuff, but at the time that I was like 12 to 14-ish, it was all dystopians. So even now I'm like looking at my shelf being like, what was the first fantasy novel I ever read? And I'm like, we got Scott Westerfeld, we have like Divergent, we have like Legend, and I'm like, no, these are all, you know.
Now I'm feeling old because those came out when I was in college.
I'm a couple of years younger than you, but not that much. But like,
for me, like, because middle school is when I really started to get into fantasy. And I went through a phase where I read like every book that involved dragons in my school library in like 6th grade. So, and I read like all of, what's her name? She did all the fairy tale retellings, and I'm suddenly blanking. Like Beauty and Rose Daughter.
Oh, I can't remember. I know who you mean, but I can't remember.
I can't think of her name. Anyway, I read like all of her fairy tale retellings. And then there was like Tamara Pierce. I feel like that was like the big YA.
The Circle of Magic series changed my life. And then her first night one, where the girl was the knight.
Yeah, those are my two favorite
that
series.
explains a lot about my writing.
Like the Blue Sword and stuff or something like that. Because that
same author. Wait, I have her stuff.
Was one of my earliest like reading of what a high fantasy.
Robin McKinley.
Okay.
Yes.
I was like, I know I have the Blue Sword on my bookshelf. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was obsessed
with that series, and she did all the fairy tale retellings.
Yeah.
So
I read everything I could get my hands on in the kids section, and the Blue Sword was one of the first ones. And I still remember it. And I have a really bad memory. And then I moved to the adult section. And it's only now, because I still have a bunch of Robert Jordan's books, like the Wheel of Time series, and like apologies to anyone who likes this series, but like I've read so much YA fantasy and then gone back to the Robert Jordan fantasy and was like, this isn't good. Like it's lots of rambling and not super great writing, and like I don't know, I just like but I was enraptured by it when I was younger. Like I devoured all of those books.
Well, it sort of went from you have let's say Redwall, and then you have Robert Jordan. Like there, like a couple, even like 10 years ago, there really wasn't a big like transitional period. So there was, you know, you had like adorable tiny fantasies for like 8-year-olds, or you had these like epic things. And I know like we say, oh, J.R. Tolkien's the one that like started this all off, but like he kind of was like there wasn't really a middle ground until now, where there's a bunch of people writing stuff for people that are in that middle ground period.
There definitely wasn't like solid like genre or categories of like, this is a middle grade fantasy, this is a YA fantasy. It was much more muddled together.
Yeah, fantasy was just like big epic adventures that were trying to emulate Tolkien. So like,
yeah.
And
a
I
lot
do
of
think
it was like for adults, but some of it was toned younger when there was less of that like categorization.
For sure.
And I think definitely like I have also looked back and like tried picking up some of the classics of the fantasy genre and felt like, oh, well, this wouldn't get published today. But I think it's just a sign of the evolution of the genre, because back then, like when things were publishing in fantasy, it was more like a little bit more self-indulgent on the world building side. Like the world building was the feature. And so taking a lot of time to describe it wasn't necessarily a detriment to the story, whereas now a lot of fantasy is very plot driven and you have to have kind of like much tighter pacing.
well, that's so interesting to see how it evolved into that.
I know for me, like who I am, you know, I read YA fantasy and I write YA fantasy. So the pacing is naturally going to be going along at a brisker, more brisk clip, so to speak.
Because the word counts are shorter.
Yeah, of course. And like, I totally get that. But yeah, you know, like trying to reread the Robert Jordan series, it's like, you know, I had an issue with the actual writing even, you know. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's just me though, and I'm too picky now.
I don't think that's just you, but
I always struggled because I kind of started reading fantasy around like late elementary school, early middle school. And like there was YA and middle grade fantasy, there just wasn't a lot of it once you read like all of Tamara Pierce's books. And so like a lot of people I think at that point in time like jumped into adult fantasy, and I just could never get into it. So I struggled for a long time before there was like a wider variety, because there were all these fantasy books I loved, and then I'd try to read like Robert Jordan or even like Anne McCaffrey. I know a lot of people here love her, but like I just couldn't get into them because they were just too grown up for like what I needed at the time, you know?
Yeah, I felt similarly.
Yeah, I fully agree. But like if I went back and read an Anne McCaffrey book, I haven't in a long time, but I'm almost certain I wouldn't have the same problem. Like I think the writing is probably good.
Oh yeah, probably.
My guess. But there is definitely that emphasis on more like a more bigger sprawling world, and we take a lot of time to explore it and that type of thing. So
yeah, and I know for me it was like all fantasy all the time, and then while I was in high school, Twilight came out. And everything kind of shifted to paranormal and urban fantasy, which we've already done a chat on paranormal. So we won't like go too in depth into that. But that's what I really occupied my time with until YA got broad enough to start like really bringing fantasy back into like popular culture, I guess.
And I wonder how much Harry Potter has to do with bringing fantasy back into popular culture, you know?
Probably a lot.
I would probably honestly credit the Lord of the Rings movies with the bringing of high fantasy, and more so than Harry Potter.
High fantasy.
So Harry Potter ushered in like the urban fantasy, so like it's in our world fantasy.
It's the same with like Game of Thrones, and unfortunately, like this is something I was saying to a friend the other day, and I'm like, unfortunately, I think if you want to make like a lot of authors want to make a cultural shift, because that's like the biggest thing you could possibly do with your life/career is actually make a change to a culture. And like, unfortunately, I almost feel like you really do have to have a movie series or a TV series, because like mainstream culture is just not as interested in books as I wish they were.
Yeah, well, you see all these people getting book deals, and this book went to auction and it's 7 figures and it's going to be the biggest thing, and there's a movie deal and it's going to be 6 books long, and then like a year later, like you never hear about it again. And it seems to me that that's been the case for a couple of years with multiple books, and it's just like there hasn't really been that next cultural shift book yet. But yeah, when the Hunger Games became big, then it was all dystopian all the time. And when Lord of the Rings was a thing, then it was like, oh, people like this. And so people started writing more, which is great. Not going to complain.
I think visual effects caught up too. I mean, obviously we've always had Star Wars, but Lord of the Rings as a film, when the movies came out, they had a lot of technology, and then they also didn't rely on it like CGI or anything quite as heavily
God.
as they, like the Star Wars
Like they did in The Hobbit.
did. Yeah, like they did in The Hobbit, pretty much. And I know for me as a teen or whatever, I got really into the world building of it. And so for me, like ever since then, anytime a fantasy has a world that really wows, I get very into it. I remember having like floppy disks where I would just like, I had these, I don't even remember if it was Word or if it was just like a notepad or something where I would take notes on all the characters, and I would go on the website and they'd be like, welcome to lordoftherings.net. And I would just start like typing down this person's name and they live here. And like maybe my parents should have been concerned. They should have been like, she seems to have some obsessive tendencies. I had a big old stack of the floppy disks.
That's hilarious.
Let's see. We've got some shout outs to Brandon Sanderson in the comments as well.
Mhm.
When did Brandon Sanderson take over the Wheel of Time? What year was that? Does anyone remember?
Was it just the last
2014
book, or
or
I might be
something?
wrong about that?
2016? A couple years ago.
I don't know if it was just the last book or not.
I'm like looking
Well,
at his Wikipedia page right now.
I finally just read Mistborn like 2 months ago, and I was like, wow, this was solid. This is like a good read. I am invested. I will read the sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also kind of at that age where I also skipped a lot of the really traditional fantasy books. So like I never read Brandon Sanderson or Robert Jordan or Ursula K. Le Guin until just very recently, because I was like, oh, I really haven't read these and I probably should.
Mhm.
But I know that those were like big books for a lot of people getting into the genre.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Have you guys read any of the Name of the Wind series?
Yes! Oh! So good!
I've been meaning to for like a
It's
couple years
so
now.
good.
So
Finished it, but I
Oh
haven't.
my god, I know it's so long. It took me a couple tries, but like, Quoth is my little baby cinnamon roll, and I love him so much, and the world is so good, and the world building is bomb, and I just love everything about it. But come on, Rothfuss, you need to come out with a third book already.
Yeah.
That's when I will read the first book.
Yeah.
I have
I've
been feeling.
only read the first one. I did the same thing with Cushil's Dart, where I read the whole first book and then I waited so long between first and second that I'm like, I now forgot everything. So I'm gonna reread the whole thing. It's such an investment.
That was definitely one that was too old for me when I read it.
What?
Yeah, I was too
So Cushil's Dart.
Oh, how old were you when you read that?
Like an early teenager, I think.
Oh,
like
yeah.
Same age.
No.
as-
That is an adult.
Yeah. Also, I tried to read that book. Actually, this was a couple years ago because Aaron, you mentioned it to me, and I was like, I'm going to try and read this book, and I was so bored. I could not get into it.
Yeah.
So
when
maybe I need to try it again. I don't know.
Yeah, when I went to the bookstore a few weeks ago, like right after Christmas, with like my Christmas present money to like buy books, that was one of the ones, because everyone keeps talking about like, oh, it's great, like fantasy romance, and I was like, oh, let me like look at this one, and so I like had grabbed a bunch of books and was like reading like the first few pages, and I like read like half of the first chapter and was like, people like this book. I'm so bored. I don't know. It was like something about like the voice of it, like I was not into. I'll try it again sometime.
I felt that with the Terry Brooks series, like the Sword and whatever it's called, Shannara or something.
Oh yeah.
I couldn't.
Speaking of people named Terry Pratchett is what I really want to go
Yes.
back and
Yes.
read more of.
I have so many of his books on my shelf. I love him so much.
I
Yeah.
know. I really need to like figure my life out and just get into his books full force.
They're really quick little books too. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah.
a couple days and that's it. They're about this big.
Mhm.
It could be a fun book club possibility, maybe.
Yeah, and they're
yeah.
fun. They're like a weird comedy fantasy mashup. Like
Mhm.
quite good. Dry humor.
You guys mentioned romance in the fantasy genre. And one of the things I was really interested about when I was kind of researching the history of fantasy in preparation for this chat was that romance as a genre was like one of the first ones to adopt fantastical elements that wasn't like a straight up fantasy. like back even like in the Renaissance era and stuff, people would write these romances that also just had like undertones of magic.
Thing.
I know there was a lot of like gothic romances back in the day where there were like ghosts and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
In like Jane Austen's time. Yeah.
Paranormal romance.
So obviously we talked about paranormal and urban fantasy before, but since we're in a new chat, what to you guys is the difference between like an urban or a contemporary fantasy and like a high fantasy? Just for anyone watching who might not know.
I think it's like world. Like if it takes place in our world, even if there are fantastical things, then it's urban or contemporary. But if it's in a fully other world, that like Mordor and Middle Earth, that like humans don't go there, you can't accidentally get there, you know, by portal or by falling down the wrong ravine, like that's a fully high fantasy world.
I remember when I was first getting into fantasy, getting way too lost in all of the like different subgenre definitions of like, this is a portal fantasy, this is a high fantasy, this is a low fantasy. Like there's so much, and like they're very specific, like sword and sorcery and all of this.
When you're trying to write it too, that can be confusing, or like, what do I put in my query letter?
I mean, Erin, you have a book that's an alternate history fantasy.
Oh yeah, I was like, which one? O'Brien and Gray, yeah. That one there. Yeah, that's like an alternate London, essentially.
Which is like, I wouldn't really consider that like urban fantasy, because it's like you're not gonna fall into this world, but it is like a familiar world.
Yeah. Well, it's been
like historical fantasy is definitely
yeah. It's been called historical fantasy, and it's been like in places pitched as like historical, which also like guys,
seems legit.
There was no murderous paintings running around in real London, so please don't pitch it word there. You never know, but
based on a true story.
Sure.
And that is where like YA, or in this case middle grade, there is more like genre mashing of like, you don't need the specific type of fantasy as much as like it seems to, at least used to have been required in adult fantasy, of like people had a very specific, I am a fan of this kind of stuff. Whereas in YA, it's just kind of
all over the place.
Sure. If you're like querying a fantasy and you're not sure if it might be contemporary or not, you can just put fantasy and like agents will know.
They'll figure it out. The only thing they don't like it if you do is if you smash too many words together when you're querying is really it's a sci-fi / fantasy / contemporary fantasy, like
portal fantasy with high magic.
And the book that instantly popped into my head was The Bone Season. I was like, yep, that's that. It's a sci-fi.
That is one of my that is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is so hard to pitch to people because it's such a genre mash that I'm like, the people are like, okay, thanks, and I'm like, no, I swear, please, it's so good.
Like a lunatic, and then to this world, and then to this world.
It's like a futuristic, but like alternate reality, sci-fi, paranormal, British novel that also has angels, but they're like from another dimension, and there's like magic and dreams, and like people are like, what?
I would throw away that query letter. Sorry.
I know, but it's so good. She makes it work.
Yes, it's true.
I don't know if I'd count that as fantasy though, because there's not really like fantasy creatures in it. I'd say that's more of like it's more of like
I don't think you
don't need fantasy
Or
creatures.
sci-fi?
There's like sort of
they have magic though, right?
they have.
We did it for a book club.
Yeah.
We did it for a book club, and I remember like nothing about this book.
I remember I gave it like 4 stars.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah, I mean, like she's a dream walker, so like that sounds pretty fantasy.
Yeah, all right, fine.
Like, it's kind of
high fantasy.
It's also sci-fi, which is confusing. Yeah.
So I had a question that I was going to ask next because I was going to be a great host, and now I don't remember it.
Genre mashing.
Yeah.
Is it writing?
Some of your favorite subgenres in fantasy.
Contemporary fantasy.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of horror in fantasy.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Oh yes.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a giant urban fantasy person. Like, give me all of like Holly Black. I grew up reading her stuff, and I love all of her creepy, weird fairies running around in New York.
Yeah. I have a hard time deciphering, even in my own writing, between dark contemporary fantasy and horror fantasy. Because like Bryony got pegged as horror, and I was like, that wasn't my intention, but okay. And Witchcraft After Moon has just been pegged as like dark contemporary fantasy. And I'm like, okay, but there's like cannibals. Really dark
yeah, that's
blood
right.
magic.
I just finished reading your book, so it's fresh in my mind. I
don't know.
Yeah,
It's
but you don't.
called horror though.
No, I feel like at the end there was a couple of like, oh geez, kind of like moments, but I wasn't like, I think I wasn't doing that the whole way through, and that's what doesn't make it horror.
I also think horror right now, marketing wise, in fantasy, particularly in YA, they're much more likely to say, "Oh, it's dark fantasy," than they are to say it's like horror fantasy.
Interesting.
Because horror is a bit of a difficult sell right now. It's the same thing. It's just horror. They're like, marketing.
Yes.
I love any sort of fantasy that have like court intrigue elements.
Yeah.
Anything where it's like everything's very convoluted and you know everyone has like motivations that you don't know about and you're like trying to figure out like who's on which side. I love that.
Like the Megan Whalen Turner series.
Yes.
That one's ending, right?
Yes. It is.
See, that's another one where I'm like, I know y'all like that, and I tried so hard, but like I can't. I don't like it.
It is very slow and very complicated.
Okay.
What's the book title?
The first one is The Thief, and it's like the Queen of Atolia, the King of Atolia.
So what is the Raven Cycle and what is Strange the Dreamer?
I say Strange the Dreamer is high fantasy.
Yeah, I would call that
because
high
it's
fantasy.
not in our world whatsoever. I
Raven
think
Cycle?
even like the main characters have like 2 hearts or something.
Yes, they do. 2 hearts, yeah. But contemporary fantasy would be Raven Cycle, right?
That's what I would call it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like high fantasy, I always thought it was more of the like traditional fantasy of like elves and swords, which isn't Strange the Dreamer.
No, but it's still in like
alternate world fantasy.
Alternate world. Like the humans literally have 2 hearts, like gods.
Yeah, like human type.
Blue creatures.
Yeah,
There's
and like
none.
magical, the like the whatever they're called, the like being the creatures that they ride on are like not even remotely close to horses, and
Alchemy is real. Yeah, there's
I just think of it as more like kind of like more modern high fantasy. Like I think high fantasy has changed.
The
in a lot of ways.
natural evolution of classic high
But also
fantasy.
something like Lord of the Rings, like it's high fantasy and it's also epic fantasy.
Yeah.
So a lot of those like big quests,
like the sword
wars.
and sorcery type, which I'm like, I'm curious if you can even sell that anymore. Maybe adults, but like, well, I guess Sarah J. Maas.
I think, I mean, well, I don't, Sarah J. Maas now, I wouldn't really consider that hers is much more romance fantasy, which is its own
thing. I wanted that series to be.
Yeah.
That's what I was hoping for, and I wanted
epic,
series like that.
Susan Dennard, her series feels very high fantasy.
I was very like epic fantasy with like multiple kingdoms, multiple characters.
Let's see. Roshni Chokshi is another like high fantasy classic for me. She has a lot of like pretty heavy romance in hers as well.
Lee Bardugo.
Yes, that's another one. The Mask of Shadows series by Lindsay Miller is another high fantasy that I love. It's all the court intrigue and assassins, etc.
Yeah.
And the gender fluid character. I love that series a lot.
Yeah. We had a question. Do you think werewolves and shifters and vampires still belong in fantasy, or have they become their own genre? They're paranormal.
See, that was a series of books that I read when I was too young. Because like when Twilight came out, I was like, ooh, I love vampires. I'm gonna read all these other vampire books. So I just like basically went to the library and ordered every single thing that had the word vampire in the title. Some of them were age appropriate, and some of them were not. You know what?
Some of them were Anne Rice.
I never read Anne Rice. That was a thing. I didn't read her. But one of my favorite
Stackhouse one after that.
I
like,
did read one of those, yeah. And I was like, I don't remember those very well, but yeah. But, like, some of my favorite series came from that. So now I'm like, oh wow, like this is actually good writing. Cool.
I love the Sookie Stackhouse ones. I still kind of do, although they're completely ridiculous. There's like every single guy she like stumbles into falls in love with her.
Mhm,
And at a
mhm.
point I was like, okay, come on, this is getting ridiculous. But I still enjoy them.
I just remember being very young and very Christian at the time and being like, oh, wow. Should have tucked that under my bed and hope no one knows I read it.
And I do think that like werewolves and shifters and vampires and like those types of paranormal creatures can show up in fantasy
For sure, yeah.
without them being like the main focus. But once they become the main focus and it's like set in our world and all of that, it becomes more of like a paranormal or urban fantasy.
Yeah. I was thinking like, oh, the City of Bones, or just, you know, whatever. I was like, I wonder if that's fantasy. I'm like, no, I think it's more paranormal because it has like magical creatures, but like it has fairies and vampires and
fantasy are under the fantasy umbrella.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
it's not
paranormal
a
is there.
different genre.
Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
They're not shelving them separately even. So
Yeah.
Like YA is just YA.
We had a question from Misty Kate. What are some good fantasy romances? Sarah J. Maas is the classic
Yeah.
fantasy romance.
I
recommend.
really like Robin Lefevre's, and hers are like historical
Green
fantasy
Lantern.
romance. Yeah,
Mhm.
I like those a lot.
Mm.
Again, Rashni Chakshi writes beautiful fantasy romances.
There's also
Just like looking at my shelf.
Yeah,
Like,
in Mask of Shadows, there's a really cute queer romance in both books. The Winter's Kiss one is another one.
Yeah.
That's
I love those books.
Marie Kowski? Is that her name?
Yeah. I'm looking at my bookshelf.
if you like witches and like trolls and under the mountain stuff, Danielle L. Jensen does Stolen Songbird, which was a really good series. Romance based, yeah, it was good.
So while you guys are thinking, if you have any other recommendations, feel free to shout them out. But if you don't, I definitely wanted to devote some time to talking about world building, particularly when you're writing fantasy. For the first half of these chats, we usually talk about like fantasy in books, but now I'm hoping to shift gears into the act of writing fantasy, since a lot of our viewers are writers. And so I was wondering, what are your... I started talking before I knew where this sentence was going. I can tell. But what is something that makes a world really stand out to you in world building? And then we can shift from that question into your own worlds.
Definitely when it's something that I have seen before, but it's done really differently. Like there's a spin on it of some kind. And then the tone of the book as well. Like obviously I'm going to use The Raven Cycle, but that has like a really mystical tone, but it still feels like it's not out of the realm of possibility. Like this might be a thing that's happening. And I really love that.
When it comes to high fantasy, like I particularly always want a book that it feels like a real world that like could actually exist kind of thing. And I think an important part of that is just making it feel like the world has layers to it, and like there are things that you aren't seeing, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes it's really easy to just focus on like the things that you need to know for the story and the things that the character interacts with, but just like knowing, like just being able to like slip in little details that make your reader feel like there's more to this world than what they're seeing is really important.
To build on what Emma said, finding those, like I feel if it's a fantasy world, your character's going to interact with daily things quite differently. So I like that little, like, would people use magic to open doors? And if they do, and showing them do it, that's like, I am invested. I am so much more, like, I believe so much more in your world if you have those like little everyday occurrences put in there.
I really like magic systems that are realistic and different. and then magic systems that have consequences of some kind.
Yes, so good.
I find that very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Definitely magic systems that even if we don't see the list, that it feels like there are rules to it. I am a really big fan of Brandon Sanderson's writing class that is on YouTube. Yes. Someone filmed, he teaches writing at BYU, creative writing, and someone filmed all those classes and put them on YouTube. I'll find a link to it and drop it. But he has one in particular on like magic systems, and that was one of the first things he talked about. And then, yeah.
Somebody, Penumbra Mine, sorry, I can't say your name properly. Oh no, sorry, it was Starry Night saying about the world building in Six of Crows, because Bardugo has a whole other trilogy to flesh it out. And I really like, if you look up anything to do with world building and Leigh Bardugo, she always says the same thing, that she starts from the source of power in her world and works backwards. Like, where does that power come from? Who is in power? How does that affect, other people? What's the fallout from that? How do they get in power? And then she starts from there. So I thought that was a really cool way of starting if you weren't sure where to start your world.
That's a cool. Yeah, I didn't think about that. I've never heard that before. That's really cool.
Yeah, a couple of interviews she mentions that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I usually like in a fantasy series when you have kind of like the sociological aspects that real people and cultures do. So like having stereotypes about certain people, or like, oh, the elves are racist to the trolls, or like because of this one war they had 100 years ago, or like, oh, this, all paladins steal, so careful when you have one of them around, or like something like that. Just like those little human things, I find like so much more, like I'm so much more invested. If it's, I guess, similar enough to our world.
Yeah, I like when you can tell somebody's thought out, like not just a magic system and the world, but like class, culture, race. Like, what are their holidays? What are their faux pas? Like, what is a mortal insult to one culture and is normal in another culture? And what happens when they clash? Like, just like 100 little questions that you could essentially answer within a scene, and keep it really interesting.
And you can really tell when someone has actually thought about those things in their world building versus when they've just like relied on and fell back on like tropes for the genre. Like, oh, this is just the way it is in like Lord of the Rings and every other like classic high fantasy. Yeah. So it's what it's going to be in this book. And like, it doesn't feel like they've really thought about why it's like that in their story.
See, in fantasy, I always do this in my first drafts where I'm like, this is how things are. And then my editor's like, okay, but what about this, and this? And then I'm like, crap. And that was with Witches of Afton Ruin. She's like, my agent was like, where is the power coming from that the witches have? So is it from a god? Is it from a source like the Force? Is it from the universe? Is it coming from inside them? And I'm going, oh, crap. Now I have to think about this. And then I had to choose a magic system and the source of their power, which ended up being Irish gods, which is where the mythology came into the first place. So it made the story way better. But yeah, I always do that in first draft where I'm like, oh, they're just magic. I don't know. Don't ask me questions.
The magic system in my current work in progress is a total mess. Because it's not a big part of the issue is it's not a big part of the story. Like the main characters don't have magic, but like it exists in their world. And so like I just didn't think about it before writing it. And so I'm just always like, I don't know, this person has some magic, whatever. They could do some stuff.
Yeah. That is for me a lot. Even this book that I am revising right now, this is the only fantasy I've ever written where I had the idea for the magic system first. And it was still, the whole first draft was very much an act of discovery and like figuring out, okay, well, what rules do I need to have figured out? And for me, it's always like, I don't have the magic system fully fleshed out until I am like in final draft stages.
Yeah. Same. Thank you.
I've written,
not just me.
I have so many notes in my like revisions, like note, like I have like a note in my Evernote where I just like write down random things I need to think about for revisions. And there's a whole part that's like, so the magic system.
What am I doing here?
Who gets magic? What can they do with it?
Penumbra just reminded me, because they said building a religion and its counter-religion was the hardest thing I ever did. That reminded me one of my absolute favorite things. If I can find it in a fantasy book, I will devour it, is weird fantasy religions and or cults.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons I really loved Leigh Bardugo's, what was her other series? Not the Six of Crows series, the one that, yes, thank you, Shadow and Bone. People are always telling me they don't like it as much, but I loved it because book 2 had that weird cult where they made her a saint.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I was like, I love this.
That sounds like what I want to do in book 2.
Yeah.
You need to read King of Scars because there's like a cult like dedicated to the Darkling in that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have it on my shelf and I haven't read it yet. So now that's gone to the top of my list. I love it.
It's so interesting because it shows the imbalance of power and what like a normal person is going to react to this one person suddenly having a ton of power and doing this amazing magical thing. Like, do you think in real life if like a superhero just touched down in New York,
no one would be worshiping them?
Yeah, like you feel like there would be some people that were, people might call them like lackeys or something, but like people would be like, well, this was an act of God and praying, and other people would be like, oh, they're a weird science experiment, and like, you never know.
People start cults and worship normal people that are just like don't shower enough. Like, it doesn't take a superhero. Like, seriously.
And the idea of like having a religion and a counter religion reminds me of something. It's kind of one of those like fantasy defaults that tells me someone hasn't thought out their world building enough. Is when it's just kind of like, oh, everybody in this kingdom worships the exact same religion and they all worship it, like a culture is not within one cultural group. Religion's not going to be like monolithic,
and there's no like clashing between the two of them. Like,
there's nobody that's like, I'm not sure if I believe in this, like it's just like they all just believe the same thing.
And in history, there's almost always someone saying, if you don't believe in my God, I'm going to chop your head off or whatever.
Creating like subgroups of the religion. They're like more extreme. So like if it's just like everybody worships in the exact same way, it feels very fun.
Where's the holy wars? Because that's always going to happen.
Yeah, actually, something. So I was listening to a podcast on ancient Greek gods because that's fun. And one of the things they mentioned that it was just one of those like small things that kind of went over my head that I was like, why have I never thought about this? And they're talking about the different religious festivals for each of the 12 gods, because the Greek pantheon is pretty famous and it's pretty cemented in their history as having these constant 12. But they're like, well, unless you were a blacksmith, you probably weren't worshiping Hephaestus every day. Like, you might, do something at his festival. You might dance in the street at his festival. But other than that, you probably weren't thinking about him all the time. And it was one of those, like, light bulb moments that I was like, of course you wouldn't. I don't think I would, like, what's something I don't do? I don't do, like, metal work. I don't think I'm going to be like, yes, let me worship this metal god when I've never stepped inside of a metal shop in my life. So, like, that kind of thing where you're like, oh, yeah. Or, like, how pretty much most likely everybody worshipped Aphrodite because love is something that touches everybody, or the majority of everybody. So you're going to have much more widespread worship than of a smaller, more niche god.
That's a really good thought, too. And in, like, if you get into something like mythology in, like, Ireland, for example, they had a bunch of little tribes, and it was very, like, selective to, like, you're from this tribe, you worship this god specifically. So there would be gods all over the country, and most of them didn't, they didn't have a history of writing stuff down. So a lot of those gods are lost. We don't know. We haven't heard of them. But a lot of the time it would be like, where are you? You're in the mountains. Okay, this is the god of whatever to do with the mountains, and you're worshiping him, right? So whatever cultural thing or wherever location you are, that could be the god you worship because they're so involved with, whatever. Or like a lot of them would where there's a goddess of winter. The people that were in the really harsh winter conditions, they pray to her, so the gods you worship are influenced by your situation, which is interesting.
It's definitely one of the things that it's a trope that I am noticing in books when I read them more, that I'm trying to get out of my own fantasies. This idea of, well, everything has just been the same always, because like I studied archaeology in college. You would think I would know better than to do something like that. But then I saw someone on Twitter talking about it recently. And at the same time, I happened to be reading the Three Dark Crowns series by Kendara Blake, which I loved, but it was like, these three triplets have been born, and since the beginning of time, they have ruled. And it was like, so they've done this for like 1,000 years, and no one has tried.
And then
Just
just
one
now
person
having
is trying
to
to
usurp
usurp someone. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um,
Really, like if you think about how much the three different factions, or at least the two, hate each other, there would have been a giant war by then. Something would have shifted. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so there's obviously a lot to keep track of, particularly in high fantasy world building. Do you guys have a process for how you keep track of it? We had related question from Michelle. Do any of you use Word Anvil or other programs / websites? But I'd love to broaden it. Just any tips you have for keeping track and organizing your world building.
No,
completely disorganized about it. So ask me for tips.
chaotic scribbles in my notebook.
Yep.
Stop me.
I
I
have the
change things multiple times. It's not consistent, and I'm like, oh no.
I don't even have tabs. Never mind a program to keep track of it. God.
I just have that like note that you have on your computer that's like, hey, go fix this later, and then it just
Mm-hmm. I am constantly keeping notes in the side margins, like, what the heck are you doing here? Or like, go back and insert this, makes no sense. Like, yeah. All the
It'll be
time.
like magic question mark. Figure it out later. That's future
What are
Rachel's
you
problem.
doing?
I literally just found a note in my like Evernote notebook that just says, honestly, what is the magic system?
I love leaving myself those sassy comments because A, it makes me laugh when I go back, and then B, I'm like, oh, I better get myself together.
I do try to, because I do use Evernote some. I haven't been very good about it lately, but especially like when I'm like plotting and world building and everything before I start writing, I'll do separate notes. So like I'm looking at mine right now, and I have like one note that's like specifically about like the gods, and so like I have some information about like I have all their names listed and what they're the god of. And some like research information I did, and like one about like the kingdom the book takes place in, and like one about the magic system. But I haven't added anything to them in a long time, which I probably should have, and I haven't consulted them in a long time. So I've probably messed some of it up. But that is useful, just like for me to like go back and look at later when I'm revising. That'll be nice to have. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely keep a note in my phone, and then. For this book that I'm revising now, sorry, I'm not sorry. I'm referencing it a lot because it's on my mind a lot right now. Because it involved multiple god-like things and lots of different types of magic. I went through the chaotic first draft, and then I made a binder, which I think I've showed off in a video before. And I have sections. Yeah, I have two sections. One is the magic section, and one is the world itself. And in the magic one, I have organized all the notes of everything I might need to know about the magic, and I would take notes on it as I was doing the read through of my book. So like, okay, this god-like character, I guess, oversees this kind of magic. Write that down so I can make sure in the future that it all lines up. And then I was able to go through and kind of, once I had all of the notes written out, figure out, okay, well, where's the overlap? Where's the gaps? Because there's always going to be gaps in early drafts. We had some people recommending some programs. Where did it go? Misty Kate said, thanks to Go Scribbler, I recently discovered Airtable, which is free. It's so helpful. The original question asked about World Anvil. So I don't know anything about that. So if you want to let us know what that is.
Poking at it since I saw that question. It looks interesting.
Yeah, I do like Auto Realm. It's a software that is free that you can use for making maps. And sometimes if it's a world that I'm having a really hard time picturing, I'll go through and make a map of it in there. We have a tutorial somewhere on this channel that I did a long time ago. It's a very rough tutorial.
It keeps getting pushed to me in my recommended feed. And I'm just like, there's Megan's face again.
There's Megan talking about stuff she doesn't know about. No, but it's like a really broad strokes tutorial on it.
I really love organization and stuff like that because I'm so bad at it. I like to see other people be good at it.
I very much like the organization part of it after the fact. It's the chaos of figuring it all out that is not quite my favorite. But once I have the lists and everything, I get, floppy disk child Megan comes out and it's like, let's do this. And Griswold said, I made a binder/workbook after Megan showed off hers. Yay! I'm so glad. Misty Kate also recommended Word Hive, or Hive Word, sorry. Yeah, so definitely everyone check all those out. How do you guys diagnose problems in your world building?
It's usually whatever I'm avoiding.
Smart. Oh no. I feel attacked.
Mm-hmm. And definitely like as I'm writing something, it's the thing that like gets me hung up for like however long, where like I should just continue writing, but I'm like, but I don't know this like one little thing. I'm like, okay, I need to think about this later because obviously if it's hanging me up, it's probably an issue.
It's usually when I'm going through afterwards, like I'll print it out and read it and be like, ah, crap, this doesn't work. And I'm the same as Kelly, like I'll just avoid it right up until I am forced to do something about it.
Let's see, if you've asked a question about fantasy or world building and I have missed it, you have my deepest apologies. Please feel free to re-ask it. I am probably not ignoring it. If it's book or writing related, I'm not ignoring it. I just missed it, so please re-ask it. MM Ward said, the best part of expanding the world building when writing a fantasy is remembering which things can't be combined or they explode. That's my nemesis, actually, because I realize I have those things and they explode everything, and now I have to change the world to make it work.
Yep.
Let's see. Do you guys have any like favorite tropes, things that show up in all of your fantasy works?
Oh, probably.
Or things that you always want to write?
I feel like a lot of them, the things I love the most, I haven't put into books yet. I'm always saving for like that right idea. Like I'd love to do a labyrinth in some sort of magical setting one day, but I've never done it because I just like I haven't found something good enough for a labyrinth yet.
Mine always have like an aspect of mystery in them. Like it can be smaller, but there's always like it's always a little bit of a whodunit. Like what's happening here? We have to figure this out so we can solve the problem, type of thing. Not that that's a fantasy trope.
Ooh, I'm a big fan of fantasy where enemies have to work together to be different, bad.
Yeah.
Like you think that one character is good and one is bad, but then you realize there's bigger bad and now they have to work together. I hope to devour every fantasy. And all of mine have some element of that. Morally great characters as well, or just straight up awful people characters. I'm also a fan of those. They don't have to be great, they can just be all bad.
Yes, the anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of any specific fantasy tropes that I really love. I mean, all I can think of right now is like the Chosen One, prophecies.
I'm
a big fan of books that turn that on its head. Like if you can.
I'm a big fan of those like orphan boy finds out that he is part of a long line of people and he's been abandoned and he's taken to court and has to figure out all this courtly intrigue, but also he's special, and like that is the majority of, I know it's like the majority of fantasy books, but when it's done well, it's done real good. Like Mistborn was great. Name of the Wind was perfect. Root of Kings did a good job, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's such a wide trope that you could put a spin on it and do it well.
Oh, like the ragtag group of friends.
Yes. Love that.
And I do love me a good quest, honestly. I love a good quest.
And I do love like curses and prophecies when they're done really well. Like it's not what you would
The curse
expect
is
it to be
good.
kind of thing, you know? Like
Yeah.
you think that it means one thing and it turns out to be something else later on.
Mhm.
I definitely am a curses person. I just realized that when you said that, I was like, oh yes, I use that a lot.
I like the quest thing, but like the quest for something that is supposedly not real, like the I don't know what you call it, like the suicide quests or something like that, where like the king is like, you're only allowed back in my kingdom if you can find me the feather of the dead phoenix, and you're like, okay, well, guess I'm just screwed. But the people are like, we're gonna go and chase this, this one trail, and then they like go on an adventure to go and try and find the thing that can't be found.
I also love like meddling gods. So good.
Oh yes.
Yes.
That relates a little bit to a question we had that I missed earlier from MM Ward. Would you prefer if fantasy books were not based on the global religious pantheons and had their own deities? I got room for all of them. The made-up ones.
Give them all. Well, like see, like Lee Bardugo has like Russian folklore, and Aaron's book that is coming out in March has like Celtic and Irish folklore. But then like Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor has stuff that's not from any pantheon really. It's just kind of her own gods, and I'm down for all of it.
We also had a question from Heidi: is soft fantasy still a thing in YA?
I don't really know what soft fantasy is, I'll be honest. Anyone got a definition for that?
My guess would be that it's like basically not quite like epic fantasy. Like it's definitely a different world, but maybe more character driven. You can correct me if I'm guessing wrong, and my apologies if I am. But I think definitely fantasy, particularly in YA, it's as all encompassing as just adult fantasy at this point. And it's everything is a hard sell, but fantasy is particularly a hard sell right at this moment. High fantasy is, but there's always space for it.
I was actually think of soft fantasy as something, and I also could be wrong about this because it's not something I'm like really read a lot of, but I feel like I always think of the type of book where like there are fantastical elements and there's magic, but it's maybe not the focus of the story, where it's more of like a character driven, more like human story, but like there is magic in the world.
Yeah, like the first Throne of Glass book. Where it was just like, here's a fantasy world, but maybe there's like this one weird creature, but for the most part it's an assassin tournament.
Yeah, there really wasn't much magic in that one until the very end.
Yeah, I still wouldn't think of that as soft fantasy though. I don't know.
Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh, there's more magic in there that I just remembered, so maybe that isn't the best example.
Like the royalty and assassins makes it not really feel like soft fantasy because it's not like a character driven type thing. I guess that is probably maybe an important part of
Heidi says something in the comments that Wikipedia seems to be backing up, which is hard and soft magic systems. So a hard magic system would be like, these are all the rules and it's laid out clearly, and then soft magic would be more vague.
I should have remembered that. Brandon Sanderson talks about that in his YouTube writing course. Link is up higher in the description.
I definitely think there's room for both. It's all about how you do it, right? You could sell both. Although fantasy in general right now, is a hard sell. But if you do it well.
And if your soft fantasy is like really literary, there's like always a market for like literary YA.
Definitely.
Because it like attracts awards and things. So and like teachers can use it in the classroom. So I think a lot of time like stuff that's going to find a market is going to have like more of a literary feel to it.
For sure.
I'm trying to think of soft fantasy, but I'm looking at my shelf and I realize that I only read high fantasy. I'm like, oh dear.
Maybe like Summer of Salt could be soft fantasy.
I was actually just thinking about that, but isn't that but it's more of a horror, so it's like is it a soft horror fantasy? Is that a thing?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as a horror.
Technically, if you're going by the Wikipedia definition of a soft magic system, high fantasy could still technically be soft high fantasy. It's just vague, undefined rules of magic, sort of, I don't know.
I don't like it.
Moral of the story: there's a lot of room for interpretation.
So I've also noticed there's a couple people in the comments that are asking if the Lunar Chronicles is fantasy. And I would say no, because they're sci-fi. Like they're fairy tale retellings, which I think some people are like, is that fantasy? But like it's a sci-fi world.
There are a few like fantastical elements
Yeah,
to it.
it kind of is a little bit of a crossover. I feel like it's kind of a genre crossover where it's sci-fi with some fantasy elements. Because it's like people settled on the moon and suddenly gained magic powers.
Yeah.
So
It's a little
it's
both.
definitely got some
Or
crossover
like using
elements. in it.
werewolves, but
Sci-fi question mark.
science.
Yeah, but werewolves are science, so
You could spin it that way, and it would probably be more interesting, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, honestly, that I love about fantasy is that it can sneak its way into a lot of different things.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's probably one of the things we've realized with lots of genres is they show up lots of places.
Oh yeah. Well, and I like that you can go all the way to like intense fantasy where it's like high fantasy, sword, sorcery, tons of magic, there's wizards, or you can go to all the way to the other end, which is like sometimes called oh boy, where it's just like a hint of magic.
Magic realism?
Thank you. I just short circuited. But where it's like you're not even sure if it's magic or not.
As a treat.
And I quite like that. I enjoy that, reading that type of thing occasionally.
And especially in YA, though, there's so much like tone crossover with sci-fi and fantasy of like a lot of sci-fi is written where we're saying that it's science, but we're not explaining how it could possibly be science. It might as well be magic.
Like speaking of soft and hard, soft sci-fi kind of sometimes bridges into fantasy a little bit. Yeah.
I actually was just thinking there's one book that there was like, it's sci-fi, we're in space, we're going to be like doing this big, we're literally on a spaceship and we're doing these trials, and then there was like this magic black stone, but it was like sentient, but like we had to go mine it on some planet, and I'm like, you're not going to explain any of this?
Like she was there.
It was just very...
Day,
But that was kind of weird, so I was like, okay, we're sci-fi, we're on a spaceship, we're doing all these sciencey things, and then suddenly magic stone, and I was like, what is happening right now?
Well, what is the name of the silly thing that Star Wars added to make it more sci-fi? Of like
midi-chlorians.
Yeah.
I was just texting my sister about midi-chlorians yesterday.
I feel like maybe some sci-fi and some magic do that where they're like, because science, and you're like, no, that's not, or like, because magic, and you're like, no, that's not how that works. No, not entirely.
I have a character in my book that I'm revising right now that's like, oh yeah, magic exists, but there's a scientific reason for it. And everyone is like, no, it's magic. And he's like, is it though? And they're like, yeah. He's like, no. Anyway, we have been going for over an hour now. So I would love to just wrap it up with thank you so much for being here, everyone. But we're going to wrap it up for today, and we will be back next week with the game night, right? That's next week.
Yeah.
I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. I wanted to wrap up on the fantasy thing first. What final thoughts, best tip for someone who wants to or is currently writing fantasy?
Besides reading all of the fantasy, because I'm assuming a lot of us started from there.
I'd say like don't stress about figuring everything out like before you start writing, or even like while you're writing the first draft, because like you will never start writing the book, or you'll never finish writing the book if you get too hung up on like, I don't know every detail of like the magic system or the world, because there will always be something that comes up. Like you're always going to find something else that like you need to figure out, and it's better to just like wait until you're done and you actually know what you need to figure out. So do what you can beforehand, and then like
edit it afterwards.
Somewhat parallel to what Emma said is like, don't get hung up on the details that you don't need to get hung up on. Because I think one of the big things that I for some reason always hear this tip of like, the questions that you need to write fantasy. What's their sewer system like? And I'm like, why is that a question on every single thing? First of all, but like
one fantasy I wrote, but not for the rest.
It's like, you don't need to explain fantasy toilets. Like, it's not one throwaway sentence. That's all you need. Like, you don't have to explain how
No one
food
needed
cooks.
that information, J.K.
You know-
Rowling.
I
Oh
needed
no!
to know
I
that
was
wizards
thinking
poop
about that
themselves.
now. But like that kind of thing. Like, don't stress too much over all the details that you don't need to.
Yeah, I as a like kind of a segue from both of you guys' comment. Yeah, that's like a really good point. Is like you can literally plan for years if you let yourself. So at some point you just have to write the book. You can edit it later.
Mhm.
Yeah. You can do the things. We believe in you.
You got this.
Again, thank you so much to everyone who came tonight. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question, but we have chats every Sunday, and the vast majority of them are about writing. So please keep coming. Please, hang on, where's the banner? I have a banner. Please like and subscribe.
Ooh, that's smooth transition.
Yeah, so smooth.
Segue.
Next week, we are going to be doing something really new and fun that we are doing for the year of 2020, which is we are scaling back on the number of book club books that we're doing, because while we really love book clubs, we also know that that's not everyone's favorite. And the viewership tends to be pretty low for book clubs. So we're adding some new fun, nerdy things. So next week we are doing a game night. Do you want to talk just a little bit about it, Kelly? Kelly is running it, so I don't actually know that much about it.
So essentially we're doing like kind of a tabletop role-playing thing, like a very not as complicated as Dungeons and Dragons, but just watching the word nerds get real silly and become someone new for an evening. But it's all going to be kind of a surprise when we jump into it next week. So we'll see how that goes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you have any tips, let us know. If you have anything you want us to chat about in the future. I know someone asked if we've discussed thrillers and mysteries yet, and I don't think we have.
No.
So we will add those to our coming soon, digging deeper topics. Any other Sunday special topics you want us to talk about, let us know. You can find us here on YouTube and on Twitter, Word Nerds Vlog, and wordnerdsvlog.com. So thank you so much for being here. We hope you will all come next week for our fun, new, experimental, nerdy game night. And yeah, we will see you then. Videos Tuesdays and Thursdays too. Bye!
Bye!
My computer's going so slow. Just keep waving.